Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. As we continue our celebration of Black History Month, we are remembering a civil rights protest in Durham that transformed the Black experience in the city's entertainment industry. Segregation kept Black Americans out of nearly all public spaces, including movie theaters. But Black moviegoers in Durham decided not to accept it at the ticket booths. WRAL's Lora Lavigne explains how these protests started in the Bull City and then spread around the country. Laura, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Grace. Thank you.
Okay, so how did you learn about this particular piece of history?
Well, it was actually someone from our team here at WREL, Jalen Jones, shout out to him, who kind of pitched the idea of taking a look at the Black cinema, movie going, and entertainment experience during the Jim Crow era in general. So anything from how media and entertainment was produced to who was able to produce it and how it was viewed, which it seems very broad, but we kind of took a closer look and found a 13-page research paper by a UNC professor, a Dr. Charlene Register, who wrote about this very topic. And so I thought it was very interesting and fascinating. This point in some of her research, she found that there was a section in High Point, North Carolina, where a manager of a white theater arranged for a Black midnight show of about 2,000 Black people. They showed up, but so did 14 white people. And according to the law at the time, the 14 white people were able to claim the hundreds of seats, and the manager had to scramble to find separate accommodations for Black viewers. And this is just one example of kind of what sparked African Americans to pursue theater ownership. And we kind of just use that as the starting grounds. I started making phone calls and found that the Carolina Theater of Durham actually has an exhibit called Confronting Change that highlights some of this and what it took for Black people to be included in these spaces here locally. And that's kind of where it all began.
Wow, that's a lot of research and background that you guys did on this project. So once you kind of got that together and decided you were going to focus sort of on the Carolina Theater here, who did you talk to for this story?
Yeah, so I met Mr. Walter Jackson. He's actually a huge now a leader here in Durham still, but he was a civil rights demonstrator in the 1960s.
When I was growing up in Durham and Chapel Hill, by and large, segregation was rigid. People lived in segregated communities.
He was one of many who contributed to the Confronting Change exhibit today, but also played a major role in the movement and push to desegregate movie theaters back then. He was only a teenager. He was a student at Hillside High School, probably roughly 15, 16 years old here in Durham, on the front lines of history. So hearing his experience and his perspective was very eye-opening. I also spoke with Dr. Michelle Scott, who is a University of Maryland professor, and she wrote a book about what is called TOBA, the Theater Owners Booking Association.
It basically served as a training ground for Black artists, so they learned how to be musicians, composers, dancers, singers. But it also served as a test or a space where they can kind of test their business skills.
And so we kind of started there and really diving into the history of what it took for Black people to feel equal across the board.
And what was going to the movies like during segregation in these different spaces?
Well, as we know, during especially the 50s and 60s, during this time, all public spaces were segregated. But for movie theaters, Black people had their own theaters, but they were often located in small rural communities that often didn't show mainstream media. So when Black people wanted to go to a show in town, let's say at the Carolina Theater in Durham, they were forced to sit at the top balcony. They called that the buzzard's roost because they had to walk up 97 steps to get there, sit in no AC, no air conditioning, and watch from such a disadvantaged view of the screen. They also had separate ticketing windows, separate lounges. So Mr. Jackson, he described it as just really degrading and humiliating.
Movie going was much more central to people's lives back in the 50s and 60s than it is today.
Black or white, it was really the thing to do at the time. And so for Black people, it was also a form of escapism, if you will, from their cruel reality, a way to kind of consume entertainment and believe that life was a little bit different for them. But ironically, something as simple as going to the movies, they were confronted with that same marginalization that they were trying to escape from.
Right. And so what outlets did Black performers find in Durham during that time?
Well, back when Carolina Theater first opened in 1926, it was used for several different purposes for pageants, live shows, community events, or motion picture films. And a lot of what we're discussing today started really long before motion picture existed, right? So we had vaudeville houses, which were essentially at the time, vaudeville circuits were performers who Scott described it as you could think of America's Got Talent. They did everything from dancing, singing, comedian shows, you name it.
They sing it, they dance it, they dream it, they live it. Cadillac car, must admit you've been.
And so in Durham, the Wonderland Theater and Regal Theater were the most notable places in Durham for Black participants and also for those in attendance to feel safe. It was kind of a cultural outlet for them, especially in theaters that were owned and operated by Black people.
Right. And so once they decided that they wanted to kind of desegregate the spaces that they didn't feel comfortable in, how did folks in Durham decide to protest during the 60s?
Yes. So, from the experience of what I had first mentioned in the turn of the 20th century, when Black people were essentially kicked out of shows, if white people attended, to the Jim Crow laws that forced them to watch in top balconies, Black people, they just had enough.
It was such a cruel system. It was dehumanizing. It cast a mark on our city, our state, and our nation, and we banded together to bring about a change.
Here in Durham and other North Carolina cities like Greensboro, they all decided to band together, walk up to the white ticketing booths in front of the theater, and ask for admission.
I am not going to serve you because of my race. I'm not going to serve you.
They would obviously get turned away and then get right back in line. So this is what they call round robin demonstrations. Hundreds of Black people would really kind of boggle down the lines at the white ticketing booth and really show a message, that sign of unity, but also a message of, okay, we've had enough. We're not going to stop until things change.
All right, Laura, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. So, Laura, you were telling us before the break about these round robin protests that started in Durham and Greensboro and just started to pick up steam there at these ticket offices. What was the initial reaction to this kind of protest?
Wow. Well, yeah, it was really widespread. Obviously, it was gaining, national attention and national news because it became so sweeping. Like I said, not just in Durham, Greensboro, and other North Carolina cities where people participated. And while their efforts and goal was to remain peaceful, many protesters were threatened.
Oh, it was absolutely a fearful time. There were people being attacked by dogs, being put in jail. There were times when people opposed to integration would be outside establishments or standing around armed.
And most of these protesters, I want to remind you, here in Durham, were young people. They were students in high school, like Mr. Walter Jackson, who we spoke to. So the initial reaction was very, described it as fearful, because at the time they were so focused on trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel, they forgot that they were also kind of putting themselves in a dangerous position because essentially, the law at the time, they were going against that. So that was kind of the initial reaction.
Wow, it sounds like such a scary thing, and they were so brave to have to go through all of that and to just have the ability to keep working towards that greater goal. When did they actually start to see change?
Yeah, so many people don't know this or kind of forget that this isn't something that happened overnight. It took almost 2 years of demonstrations like this, similar to this, for them to begin to see change. So this was in the 59 or early 1960s when Durham And the Carolina Theater of Durham became a focal point of the civil rights movement. We had attorney Floyd McKissick, along with NAACP youth leaders, John Edwards, Vivian McCoy, Walter Riley, who really challenged the system of inequity in about 1961. But it wasn't until May of 1963 when a new mayor was elected in Durham, and he really worked to convince the Carolina Theater's management to embrace the idea of integration. In July, the theater began operating without segregation. It was one of the first in the country to do so. And then 2 months before, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is when this happened. This was also a year before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's really mind blowing to believe that some of the steps that were put into motion in Durham kind of really launched into a movement across the country.
Did Mr. Jackson talk at all about what it was like when he was able the first time to go into a theater and not sit in that really high balcony and to just sit there like everybody else?
Yeah, he said it was pretty unbelievable.
It was a burden lifted to see those walls begin to fall.
But it was eye-opening to hear from him because even though, and this goes with any public, spaces at the time, even though, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, even when Carolina Theater really embraced the idea of integration, some, white people still didn't abide by those rules or the new rules. They didn't want to accept it. So it still took time for people to kind of live in this new world and accept it.
And all these years later, how does he and other people involved in these protests reflect on their work?
Mm. Yes, Mr. Jackson was telling me that a lot of them are obviously very proud.
We had no idea of the impact that what we were doing would have, but it has literally changed the world.
I only spoke to one, of those demonstrators. There were hundreds and hundreds, and a handful of them that participated in creating the exhibit at the Carolina Theater that's there today. But they're really just proud, and they want to continue to make sure that their stories are told and that the history is visible. It's in plain sight for people to learn about and never forget.
And for you working on this stories, what takeaway did you have from it, or what impression did hearing all of this make on you?
Yeah, I can go on and on about the takeaways for me, but just something as simple as going to a movie theater, which is so easy for you and I today, without any constraints, to think about the challenges they went to go through that. This movement goes beyond just wanting to participate in a show and watch a show, but to know that you can sit next to someone who is a different race, a different color, come from a different background, and see that transcend beyond the four walls of the theater, but in everyday lives, changing the point of view of people who essentially, thought that their worlds could not intertwine with each other's. I think that was the biggest takeaway for me, is just knowing that this goes beyond just the movie going experience, but how we live today. Another big takeaway for me was when we're discussing how Black theater ownership was really on the rise. It also played a huge role in Black entrepreneurship because they learned so many different skills of running and operating and owning their own theaters that it contributed to a lot of the success that we saw here in Durham. And Durham was such a focal point, and still is, for researchers to look at, because during the time, the population of Black people was very large, but the population of successful Black people who owned and operated their own businesses. We had Black Wall Street, we had the historic Hayti community. So I think it was pretty cool to look back and see how entertainment really became more than just entertainment, but really changing the trajectory of Black lives in general.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about these amazing work that these folks did to make sure that we can all share in the arts together. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. If you listen to this podcast on WRAL.com or on the WRAL News app, you can also find it in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow the show so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening.